Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our semester event. I'm Zach, the president of Rationality, and tonight we'll have Dr. Robert Howdy speaking about the problem of evil and whether that is a good objection to the existence of God or not. If you've got any questions for him, please put them in the YouTube chat. We'll have someone going through the YouTube chat and picking out some questions for a Q&A at the end of the night. Also, if you would, please share the link to this event on your social media accounts if you have any. We'd like to get the word out on the event since it's about a pretty important topic, and we're recording it so you can watch it later if you want. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a bit about our organization. Rash Christi is an organization devoted to Christian apologetics, which means that we try to give good reasons and evidence for why we believe Christianity is true. We provide a place for civil discussions about topics such as the existence of God, the resurrection of Jesus, and the reliability of Scripture. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then I invite you to come check out our group. And we'll be meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. in the Union, so hope to see you there. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Adam Johnson, who will introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Robert Howdy.
All right, well, I'm very excited to bring Dr. Howdy back to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln to speak on this important issue of the problem of evil. Dr. Howdy was professor of philosophy at UNL from 1973 to 2003. Even though I was studying actuarial science when I was a student at UNL in the 1990s, I took Philosophy 101 just as an elective, and Dr. Howdy was my professor. Later on in life, when God called me into ministry, I began studying his work more in depth, especially when I was working on my PhD in philosophy. I had the chance to run into him again a few years ago in LA. We were both presenting philosophy papers at a conference of the Society of Christian Philosophers. Last year, I started talking to him about presenting a lecture back here at UNL, and I'm so thankful that he agreed to do so. Dr. Howdy is currently the John A. O'Brien Professor of Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. He is past president of the American Philosophical Association and the past president of the Society of Christian Philosophers. He's the author of multiple books, including 3, which I'll mention: Means, Ends, and Persons, published by Oxford University Press; Moral Perception, published by Princeton University Press; and Epistemology, published by Routledge. Please join me, everybody, in welcoming Dr. Howdy.
Are we ready then?
Yep, go ahead.
I wanted to make sure all the introductions were concluded. Let me just say I'm very glad to be talking to these groups and on this topic. It's an immensely important topic. I'm going to try to say what I can on this in maybe 45 minutes. I'll be brief, but you have my outline, and I'm going to give a lot of examples. I want to start by saying that the problem of evil is particularly important for believers because it is something like the rock on which many of the faithful come to shipwreck. I don't think there is any single intellectual and existential worry that gets people to drift away from faith as much as the problem of evil. Let me then go directly to part 1. The problem of evil, I should say right off, is not the problem of how to get rid of or reduce evil in the world. That is a problem. We should all care about it. But the problem of evil is different. It's how to square the amount and kind of evil in the world with the existence of God. That brings me then to the existential and intellectual aspects of the problem. It has both, and I'm going to talk mostly about the intellectual aspects, but I don't think one can do that well without touching on the existential aspects. The existential problem is illustrated by a forest fire that kills a lovely child, or by dictators murdering innocent protesters. A forest fire is a natural event, and the death it causes is a natural evil. A dictator is morally evil, and the killings there are moral evils. I'm going to talk about both kinds, but the prospect is just terrifying when one comes face to face with it. I like to cite Shakespeare here. Many of you know Shakespeare's play Macbeth. In it, we see the slaughter of the wife and children of Macduff, who is the arch enemy of Macbeth, who has seized the throne. Macduff is told gradually what happened, and he says, "Did you say all my pretty ones?" Well, of course, we know it was all. We saw the scene. It's almost too horrible to bear. And he says, when they tell him to take it like a man, "I shall do so, but I cannot but remember such things were that were most precious to me. Did heaven look on and would not take their part?" Now that is an outcry that, in other words, we have heard through history. Where was God when these evils happened? Now there's no simple answer to that question. Indeed, no exact answer from any of us. But there is this existential problem of living with evil and simultaneously with the thought that God is sovereign in the universe. Now, the intellectual problem is how to deal with the argument from evil and things of that kind. So I give you the argument from evil, which is very simply, if God, conceived as perfectly good, all-powerful, and all-knowing, exists, then there is no gratuitous evil, that is, roughly, evil not required for a greater good, just there with no proper explanation. But, says the second premise, there is gratuitous evil, hence, God does not exist. That's the atheological conclusion. Well, to address the problem, and now I'm thinking chiefly of the intellectual problem, we have to consider two major dimensions of cognitive attitudes like belief and faith. There's the psychological dimension and the evidential dimension. Now think about the attitudes a theist may have, though not all of them simultaneously, toward this important proposition that there is no gratuitous evil, that evil is counterbalanced or defeated. It's required for a greater good. First, you can believe there's no gratuitous evil. Many do. You could also have faith that there is none, and that's not exactly the same thing. Not that you couldn't have faith and belief in one attitude, but you could have faith without having belief as a constituent, even though you couldn't disbelieve. And then, of course, you could have hope. Now, take as a simple example the pandemic. You might believe that we will transcend the pandemic and that we will come away with a sense of the human community that we could not have gotten otherwise, a sense of one world that all of us are in a connected way. But suppose you don't believe that and you don't disbelieve it, but you trust that it's so. Somehow God will make it so. Now you can be said to have faith that it is so. And if you have so much doubt that you can't have faith, you certainly can hope that it's true. So belief, faith, and hope are different attitudes, all religiously significant and different from each other. Now, to understand the problem, we have to pair this triad of attitudes with two kinds of positive normative status. Positive normative status is roughly approval worthiness. So justification is one case. If you're justified in believing that there's no gratuitous evil, then you have an attitude that is not only rational, but well evidenced. You can't be justified in believing one thing and in disbelieving it. But there's another attitude that is positive, rationality. And in special cases, you could go either way. So take something of enormous complexity, like the question whether in the long run, the pandemic will have brought us together so that the evil of it is outweighed. Well, you certainly can hope that that's true without any particular level of evidence. It's a rational hope. But what about someone who is pessimistic? Can that person rationally take the opposing view? I think where there's this much complexity, you can have a rational view that something's so, and you could have come down the other way. Whereas with justification, you can't come down both ways, one or the other, not both at once, of course, when you have the same degree of evidential support. Now, that's going to be very significant for us. I'm going to begin to put these things together, three kinds of attitudes that are important in religion, and two important statuses, rationality statuses for the outlook, the religious outlook. So I first want to refine a little bit the talk of faith. Faith may be doxastic, belief entailing, or it may be non-belief entailing, and we can call it fiducial. A fiduciary is a trust. Fiducial roughly means having to do with trust. So if you trust that the pandemic will be outweighed, you needn't believe it, though you may not disbelieve it. But you have a certain attitude that is sustaining and positive. So fiducial faith is a kind of faith that contrasts with belief in the required level of evidence and in the confidence level, but is stronger than hope. And it's natural to call it trust faith. Notice that if you trust that someone undergoing surgery is going to make it through, you can't believe she won't, but you don't have to believe that she simply will. You can say, well, do I believe it? I certainly hope it's true. I trust that it is, but the evidence is divided. I can't quite say I believe it, but I want to. That's the sort of thing that can go with trust faith. Now, I'm not talking about the position of the will and the heart. These are very important in religious attitudes, whether they have the high confidence of strong belief or the low confidence level of hope, which can be very ardent and very motivating. Now, just to indicate a way of understanding this problem of evil that is gradual, I talk about propositional faith and attitudinal faith. Faith that something is so is faith with a particular content. So if you have faith that will transcend the pandemic, that's one important proposition. But if you have faith in God, there's no one proposition that's involved. Faith in God is largely, though not entirely, a matter of faith that 1, 2, 3, 4, uncountably many things hold. but it has propositional components, such as that God is sovereign in the universe, that God loves us, that God will save us. There are many cases of faith that, with propositional objects that are very specific, that are elements in global faith, which is faith in. But it's much easier to talk about rationality when you focus on a single proposition, such as that there is no gratuitous evil, which is the key premise we want to focus on and deny in dealing with the problem of evil. So, coming now to the attitudes theists may have, let's look at 4 cases where we mix the type of attitude with the type of status, either justification or rationality. Justification is the less permissive status. If you're justified in believing something, you're rational in believing it, but you can be rational in believing it when you're not quite justified. You need more evidence for justification. So, take the proposition that evil is all required for a greater good. There's no gratuitous evil. Well, first there's justifiably believing this. Very good. Then there's justified trust faith. You have faith that there is no gratuitous evil. But there's also rational trust faith, which requires less in the way of evidence than justified trust faith. Justification tends to require evidence, often in the form of premises you can adduce to support what you believe. But rationality is more perspectival, and it can free you from having to list evidential statements in the way you might have to if you're justified and mean to show that. Finally, let's bring hope in. You can have rational hope that there is no gratuitous evil with hardly any evidence at all. You can't rationally hope for what you should see as impossible, nor for what you believe is false. But you can hope for what you think is highly improbable, but possible. Now, I don't think it's highly improbable that the pandemic will be transcended in terms of its evil. I don't have an exact probability here. I certainly have a rational hope here. I even have, I'd say, a rational trust that in the long run, it will be overcome. Now, what I've done by indicating that theists have more choice among theistic attitudes than one might think, and that there are more statuses for evaluating those attitudes rationally, is to free us from a certain straitjacket. It's the straitjacket of justified belief as the minimal acceptable status for theism. That is a high bar, which certainly may be achieved by some, but is not easily achieved by all. And the key point for Ratio Christi is that there can be rationality even if there isn't full justification. And rationality, it is widely agreed, is the minimum status for intellectual acceptability. So there's no intellectual embarrassment in a position that you rationally hold, even if you'd like to be able to convince skeptics that they should come over to your side. That's a very tall order. Part 2. And by the way, I've already implied hope combined with the right desires, the right position of the heart and will, modest though it is intellectually, can, I think, be the core of a rational religious commitment that is a major element in human life. Part 2, some value theoretical aspects of good and evil. Here, I give you a bit of theory of value because you have to understand the theory of value really to understand the problem of evil. I've talked about counterbalanced evil. Let me give you a very simple example. It's from nursing. You slip on the ice and scrape your knee badly. It's bleeding. A nurse is walking by and is a good Samaritan. You are nursed with attention, concentration, consummate skill, respect, a bit of affection, not highly personal, but clearly you're not just an object to be repaired. The experience is so positive in terms of human relations and being cared for that you would rather not have skinned your knee. There really are experiences like that, but it's impossible to have the experience of having a wound nursed and skillfully treated without having the wound. The wound is a kind of evil. It's painful. So here we have an evil that is counterbalanced. You couldn't have the good, which is greater than it, without it. It's even defeated in the sense that it's part of a whole that is desirable. Now, what I'm talking about is that value is organic. It's not mechanistic. Think of a painting. The aesthetic value of a painting is not the sum of the aesthetic values of the parts or aspects. It may be that if you divided the painting into small squares, which you looked at in isolation, none of them would be beautiful, but put them together to yield the whole that the artist gave us, and you have something of enormous value. Now, why not think of the universe as, in important ways, like a divine painting? Its value is not mechanistic, but organic. And of course, we don't know the whole universe, and we don't know how to judge even major parts of the universe. But clearly, value is organic. It is not merely additive. And clearly, a divine creation should be viewed as an organic whole. So, even if the universe is physically mechanistic, which is not at all clear, it is valuationally organic. Part 3. Now here, in part 3, I present something that I think you don't run into worked out as I've worked it out. In any case, the idea is quite simple. Let's look at the problem of evil from a theocentric, a God-centered, not a cosmocentric, a world-centered perspective. After all, the problem is how to square the evils of the world with the existence of God. So we can't leave God out. We can't just look at the painting. We have to look at the painting in the context of creation by the artist. So the total reality to be evaluated is the reality consisting of God and the creation. Even the atheist has to hypothesize that God is in the conceptual picture in order to ask whether we can square the possibility of God with the evils we know of. So we have to look at the total reality, and I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to start with the simple question, does divine experience have value? Surely it does, and surely its value is incalculable. The Bible tells us God saw that it was good. Well, it's not as though God was supposed to be surprised, but there's a sense in which God is not indifferent to the creation or to us, of course. So God is not detached in the picture I'm imagining we should have here. And I suggest that the value of divine experience, good or bad, is incalculable. So the gratification when free beings do what they ought with virtue, courage, beauty, that's gratifying in a certain way. That's special for God, but gratifying. That's immensely valuable. If we do evil, that's something that might be painful for God in a certain divine way. It's not something God is comfortable with. At least I'm willing to talk about a personal God in that way. So we have a total reality conception, and we have to think about God in creating. And now here is a hypothesis that I think very plausible. There's an important role love plays in the theocentric approach. And I cannot see how God, as perfectly good, could create beings with the complexity of you and me and the capacity for joy and suffering without caring about us. Now, caring is really the core of brotherly as opposed to passional love. So I think divine love, which has been called agape, is in part, and very importantly, a matter of caring about us for our own sake, not as means to an end. So it seems to me we should expect that there is more to life than meets the eye, given what little we can see and what we take ourselves to know about God. And that brings me to part 4. I want to start with moral evil, which is roughly wrongdoing by created persons. Now, one thing we have to appreciate is that it is impossible to create us as fully free while controlling what we do. So God must create free beings if that is the kind of being God loves and regards as most valuable. Even if creating unfree beings programmed to do only good would not do any moral evil. This brings us now to something many have studied in philosophy, the free will problem, which involves the question whether freedom and determinism are compatible. Suppose they're not, which I think is not at all obvious, but suppose they're not. If they're not compatible, then God can't create a deterministic world and free beings. Now, I think that there are reasons to doubt that God would create a deterministic world. Think about what that would mean for an omniscient being. Knowing every knowable truth and creating a world with certain characteristics and certain laws, God would foresee every single action any of us performs. And why would God want to create a world that is foreseeable in exactly that way and that is like the unfolding of a program? It would be a little like having a paragraph on your computer screen with a complete grasp of it, the kind of grasp God would have, and then printing it out. Why print it out? What's to be gained? The whole thing is in your head. And if you have a powerful imagination, and certainly if you have omniscience, all the consequences and implications are very clearly in your head. On the other hand, if the world is indeterministic, then there are certain things which omniscience doesn't carry. God can know any knowable truth, and God can bring any possible event about. But how will God know whether I am freely going to raise a hand? Well, God can command it by fiat, and then I have to raise it. But in that case, it's not free. If determinism is true, God can read it off from the past plus the laws of nature, but that's determinism again. And I don't think God would create a deterministic world. In an indeterministic world, omniscience would enable God to know the kinds of being we are, but not every single free action in advance, even though once we act, of course, there is a truth that God knows. Now, there may be some theological questions about whether this is a view every Christian denomination can embrace, but it's certainly a view Christians, broadly speaking, can embrace given biblical content, I think. Now, even if we agree that God can't foreknow what a free being is going to do in every possible situation, we might think God still can know which of the possible worlds to be created is the best. And shouldn't God create the best possible world, as the philosopher Leibniz thought? And some of you may know that Voltaire, the French author, caricatured Leibniz in his Candide. Well, I don't think there is a best possible world. Think of it this way. Just as there is no finite number of integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., there's no absolute limit to the number of good persons who can be created. So for any possible world, there's always another possible world with more good people in it who presumably get along well enough to make the bigger world better than the other world. Well, if there's no best possible world, how can God rationally create the world that is created? No one has a full answer to that question. But the broad answer we need is that a world need only be choice-worthy for God, theologically choice-worthy. And that does not require its being the best possible any more than choices we make can be good choices only if they're the best possible. So what I've done here, in effect, is to reframe the problem of evil theocentrically. The usual approach to it, which is limited but not wrong altogether, has as its central question, is the world good enough to have been created by God? I think the question should be, is creating the world good enough for God? Think about God's creating, God's living with the creation, the value to God of the creation and living with that creation. Is the creation good enough for that, for God's making that choice? I think the answer to that is positive. It can be, and Christians have faith that it is, as do many other faiths. All right. I don't want to go on too long, but I will just pause a little longer on that. We don't know the whole created universe. We don't know how all the parts fit together. And there's a great deal we don't know about the next world, presumably. So that brings me to part 5, which concerns natural evil and a comparison between natural and moral evil in relation to the possibilities of afterlife. So, must God permit the unintended suffering of the innocent? So we have the beautiful infant who is killed in a forest fire, and we have also Roe's fawn. William Roe, who was, in his own words, a friendly atheist, raised the question why we should think that the evil of a fawn's dying painfully in a forest fire is counterbalanced. Well, we don't know that it is. And here, the comparison between animals and ourselves is very important. One thing you could say is that animals' suffering is counterbalanced by the value of animals in the world to them so far as their lives are good, and to us as companions in this dangerous world, where what they mean to us and what we learn from them is worth even more than the negative value of their suffering. You could say that. That's counterbalancing. But for you and me, the issue is harder. What happens when the infant dies in a forest fire? Now here, it matters greatly what your eschatology is, your theory of final things, death and resurrection. If, as is surely possible, a person can survive the destruction of the body, then afterlife is possible. If it's possible, God can bring it about. Christianity says that there is resurrection, there is the life everlasting. Well, if the infant's life has a later stage that is everlasting, then the suffering that goes with the forest fire can be like a tiny blotch that is scarcely visible in the corner of a painting, which does not detract from its overall value. Maybe it even has a complementarity to it. And if you think about the total development that's possible for that person, there can be a place that any memory that survives, if any does, of that evil, makes it something with a certain meaning and gives it a place. So at least if you take the view that life on earth is not the only life, then the problem of evil, again, can't be looked at just in terms of the created world if you're thinking of the universe, because afterlife would not be in the physical universe. So this is a dimension where faith and hope come in a major way, because it's very difficult to have arguments that on their own carry the day. I don't say one couldn't, but the point is there's no impossibility here. Rational hope is certainly possible. Justification is within reach for certain people with enough in the way of thinking, reflection, evidence. Now, is there a way recompense could occur even for animals, so that in addition to the evil of animal suffering being counterbalanced, it's defeated? Well, it's not at all obvious how to work that out. But I think at least that natural evils can be regarded as counterbalanced, and maybe they can be regarded as utterly defeated. That is, not only required for a greater good, but an essential part of a greater good where they play a contributory role. Okay, maybe there's one more point I have time to make here. I've spoken in my notes of the possible value of a dangerous world. I've illustrated the value of caring for others in the nursing case. There, I concentrated on the patient, but caregiving has enormous rewards. So, putting it one way I like to put it, my vulnerability is your opportunity. Your vulnerability is mine. There's a great deal of good in overcoming evil and in doing for others. There's a great good in receiving from others, and the more loving the giving, the better the receiving. Part 6, tolerance and respectful disagreement. This is something Adam particularly wanted me to emphasize, and I'm happy to do it. There's a lot of disagreement on theism, on evil, and public discourse is currently rather fragmented. Few can talk with others they seriously disagree with. Well, here it's good to begin with the love commandments, and particularly the very demanding second one, love thy neighbor as thyself. It's hard to interpret this from a doctrinal point of view, but any plausible interpretation makes it a very demanding standard. But it is a very good standard. And there are ways to understand it so that we can at least try to approach living up to it. And that requires more than mere belief. And here, faith and hope and the position of the heart and the will are absolutely crucial. So religious commitment must not be conceived just intellectually, even though we're looking at the intellectual side largely now. It has to be conceived as a commitment of the heart and the will, guided by the intellect, to be sure. But if you don't have positive feelings and attitudes towards others, and you're not motivated to do anything for others, you are not conforming to the second love commandment. You all know that, of course. Anyone would understand that. Now, how do we handle disagreement? Well, common ground is crucial, and it's intrinsic to the human family. Why a family? Well, if we're all children of God, then there's a sense in which we're a family. But look, we all suffer pain. And indeed, we're really very much alike in the kinds of pains we suffer, certainly physically, but we are all subject to embarrassment and humiliation. Those are aspects of the human condition. There are violations of human dignity that we all feel very keenly. In pleasure, we're less alike than in pain, but we all enjoy conversations, sports, the arts, and many of our best pleasures are interpersonal. So we should be motivated to widen our sphere from those we already know to those we don't. And if we want peaceable coexistence here and across the globe, we have to move from a sense of human dignity to a sense of everyone as capable of trying to understand us, particularly where we are trying to understand them. So starting with the understanding of pain, suffering, and disease is something. It doesn't take much to appreciate those things, to try to alleviate them, to express concern for people suffering them. It's also clear that people enjoy free activity, sports, the arts, conversation. Much of our best pleasure is interpersonal. So again, we should be motivated to connect with each other and to maximize the common ground we have. Now, there's also learning to persuade and to substitute persuasion for coercion. Part of the point of an education, and certainly of a philosophical education, is to learn to persuade by reasoning rather than to try to change behavior by coercion. Persuasion works from the inside. The person convinced is self-motivated in doing the thing that you think ought to be done, and you can do it together. The person coerced is like a coiled spring waiting to break free of its bonds. Coercion is unstable and doesn't work when you don't have enough power and doesn't last even when you do. So we have to learn to have enough empathy to get inside the perspective of someone else, inside the life. And sometimes we have to work with what someone else believes and move from that to something we hope we can both believe, as opposed to just arguing for what we believe and assuming that the great premises we bring forward will produce conviction. It may not be that easy. It may not be possible at all. So we need listening, empathy, having a sense of how the other person feels and where the other person stands, patience, and tolerance. Tolerance is not approval, but you can tolerate in a friendly way and hope for change. So at least where we don't approve, we don't have to fight if we can manage with tolerance and somehow achieve mutual understanding in the long run. Well, I said I'd try to be brief, and in that spirit, I'm just going to move towards some closing comments. I've offered you a pluralistic theory of value in which love has a central place. Love entails caring about the good of those we love for their sake, not for ours. So it's altruistic and not egoistic. The egoistic person can be beneficent, but love is altruistic. Many things are of value, and if you love someone, you want that person's life to realize a plurality of values, not necessarily the ones that you favor realizing, but some of the ones there are, and there are real values. I've also suggested an approach that frees us of 3 straitjackets. These straitjackets are bonds that hold us back. There's the metaphysical straitjacket of cosmocentrism, world-centeredness, looking at the problem of evil just in terms of the creation and leaving God out. There's the epistemological straitjacket of strong justification as our evidential baseline, as the minimum line for rational respectability. That's a very high standard. We don't demand it outside theological matters. I don't know why we have to demand it inside theological matters. And indeed, I'd like to add this having to do with faith and reason. In my view, and I've written on this as on these other problems, at least Christianity, and I think perhaps some other religions too, generally don't call on us to do things that can't be rationally defended in their own terms to somebody who is simply intelligent and open-minded and willing to think about what is really valuable and what is not. That takes some arguing, but that anyway is, if you like, something in which I have faith. I've also tried to free us from the psychological straitjacket of assimilating faith to belief. Some faith entails belief, but not all of it does. Faith and belief are closely related, but not exactly the same. Philosophers take differences seriously and work with them. And in addition to faith as trusting that and trusting in, there is hope. Now, it seems to me that trust and hope, even without the usual accompaniment of belief, can be major religious stances. Trusting in God is a major religious element, and it can be central in a rational religious commitment. Let me stop there and open the floor for discussion. I look forward to questions and comments.
All right, thank you, Dr. Audi. That was very good for me to listen to. We will have a Q&A shortly, but before that, I'd like to turn it over to David to tell us about the Philosophy Club.
Hello, all watching. I'm David Cavada, the current president for the UNL Philosophy Club. We have weekly meetings during the semester to talk about different philosophical topics. Our biggest draws for attendance are topics pertaining to ethics. So we particularly have a lot of topics concerned with ethics. You can find us on Instagram at UNL Philosophy Club or on Involve You through the campus website. And I hope to get in contact with some of you so that you can become members of our club. And I think you'd all be potentially valuable as we welcome people of all kinds of backgrounds to our club. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. As a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the YouTube chat. And now I'd like to turn it over to James to tell us about Crew.
Exactly. So my name is James Prush, and I'm actually on staff with Crew at the University of Nebraska. I'm not a student, former student here. Crew is an international ministry that serves people in every segment of society. We don't focus primarily on philosophy, but really how our philosophy and worldview and theology take shape in our everyday lives. And so here at the university, our vision is to see every student and faculty know someone who truly follows Jesus. And so what we do is simple. We introduce people to Jesus. We help them explore who Jesus is. We do that in a lot of ways. And one of them is partnering with Ratio Christi in events like this. We help people grow as they follow Jesus, and then equip people to reach other people with the good news of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. And so one of the main ways we do this is we connect students at the university in what we call Cru Connect groups, which are just small groups of people who intentionally follow Jesus together, ask hard questions, get honest answers, and really pursue a community of people who are different than a non-Christian community. So if you want to know more about Cru, you can visit nebraskacru.com to get in touch with us. You can send us an email at nebraskateam@cru.org, or you can find us on Instagram at UNL.Cru. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, James. So now we'll have our Q&A time, and we've been taking questions at the YouTube chat. If you have any more questions, you can, of course, add them in there now. And for the Q&A time, we'll have Elena, the secretary from Rational Christie, asking the questions to Dr. Audi, and Dr. Audi will answer them. So over to you, Elena.
All right, thank you. So we have quite a few questions here in the chat, and I guess we'll just get started. So the first one is, does evaluating the problem of evil from a theocentric approach perhaps require certain assumptions regarding valuations God might or would make? And that's the first question. If you need me to repeat it, I can do that too.
Okay, you're hearing me now, I think.
Yeah.
I think it would be good if you repeat it, because it was very carefully formulated, and I want to make sure I get it right, and others might like to hear it again. Let's hear it again.
Okay. Does evaluating the problem of evil from a theocentric approach perhaps require certain assumptions regarding valuations God might or would make?
Okay. This brings up the question whether there are any a priori constraints on the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, which we can bring to the table without second guessing God and trying to figure out exactly what God would judge. So I think the broad answer is there are certain broad standards that we can assume here. And if we couldn't raise the problem of evil in the first place. But on the other hand, we can't presume to figure out exactly what God would judge or why. So we wouldn't have a problem of evil if we didn't think pain was genuinely a bad thing, and that murder was wrong, and torture wrong and awful. But we don't know exactly what categories of judgment God would use. They go beyond ours. And we don't know all the details of the evaluation or the consequences, etc. So I don't think I've done anything theologically implausible here or philosophically implausible. I've made only the assumption that there really are things that are good and that are bad, that are right and they're wrong. And if you don't assume that, you really don't get hold of the problem, and you shouldn't be as worried about the problem as many are.
All right, moving on to the next question, if you're ready. Could it be that hope and or faith could be used to believe things that are not true? And if so, how do we justify using them, that is hope or faith, intellectually?
Okay. I like to keep a record, and I think while I write, so pardon me if I take a little time here. A simple way to describe what the questioner has realized is that hope and trust are not factive. That is, you can hope that something when it doesn't happen, never will. You can trust that something's so when it isn't. That's fallibility. That is an element in the human condition. However, I've been arguing that there are rational hopes and that there's rational trust and even justified hope and justified trust. And there, the likelihood, the probability that you're wrong may be very low, especially with trust. Although even with hope, you could hope that someone will survive surgery when really, if you were a little more optimistic and looked harder at your evidence, you'd trust that the person will. So things are better than you think. We're highly fallible. But let me bring in a subtlety that I didn't get to bring in. With religious hope and trust, the truth of the thing hoped for can't be satanically bad. You could hope that somebody dies painfully, but that's not a proper religious hope. Hope that somebody will reform is another matter altogether. So there, you see a tremendous difference. Religious hope and religious trust, properly guided as they can be, I think, in the Christian tradition, they certainly can be, will have objects of positive value. So you have fallibility, but there are some real constraints in the neighborhood.
All right, thank you.
People
all
can
right.
come back at me if they want to, by the way, if you can manage it. I leave that
Yes.
to you. Yeah.
If you would like to add any follow-up questions in the chat, please go ahead and do that. If there are none, though, we will move on to the next question, which is, could God ever allow or create a less than greatest possible world to be actualized?
This is disputed. I gave you a reason to think that there is no best possible world. I didn't use the word great. And the idea is that if you take any world and you assume that there are good things in it, but let it be people, then unless you think there is some finite limit on the number of good things God can create, and I don't see how omnipotence can be limited like that, you have to allow that there is a possible infinity of good things. And there, take any world actualized. If it's actual, it's going to have a definite number of persons who are accountable. So it looks to me as though you're not going to be able to say an actual world is the greatest possible. There's no better one. Take any world that's actual. I am assuming that an actual world doesn't have an actual infinity of persons. It has some huge finite number maybe. But maybe that is the controversial assumption here, whether there can be actual infinities. See, there's an infinity of numbers and an infinity of possible people. But if you take any actualization of people to be real in the way we understand, it's got to be finite. At least that's one perspective. So it's a perfectly good question. However, suppose there is a best of all possible worlds. Let's just suppose that's right. Must God think that the most choice-worthy world from God's point of view is the best in terms of total quantity of goodness? If goodness is organic, it may be that the preferred world is the one God wants to create. Look, let's go to love for a minute, just to tie this in with something very important in Christianity. I've done a book in philosophy of religion called Rationality and Religious Commitment. Adam didn't mention that, oddly, but here it is in part. I argued there that love is not a meritarian attitude. Think about it this way, very simply. We don't love people in proportion to their merits. Often we love people in a strange positive proportion to their demerits. Certainly parents love in spite of demerits. So if God loves in the sense in which love makes the most sense to us, it's not at all obvious that God would love better beings that are better than we. I think I can imagine beings better than we, but I don't know that we should regard them as preferable from the point of view of divine creation. That's up to God. I don't know how to judge that exactly. But love is not a meritarian attitude. If love is crucial in the creation, then that's a reason to think God doesn't have to create the best possible world, if there is one.
All right. The next question is somewhat long, so if you need me to repeat any part of it, I can do that as well. So might there be non-epistemic value in creation? That is, might there be a motivation to create that goes beyond one's total grasp of the product? And the example is printing a paragraph because one loves its content.
I think I got the question, but the core issue is whether there might be value in creating that goes beyond what one would know if one created. Do you read it that way, or do you want to read that part again?
The second part that says, might there be a motivation to create that goes beyond one's total grasp of the product?
I think the answer is yes. But if we're thinking about divine creation, I don't think we have room for the creations going beyond the total grasp, apprehension, understanding of God. So if the question is aimed at whether the theocentric idea works, it isn't a serious challenge. There was no suggestion that God creates only for the sake of what is known. In fact, very little in the abstract wouldn't be known in advance. The only thing I suggested as not known in advance might be what free beings will do in situations that may never arise. Maybe even what free beings will do before they do it, but that's a different related consideration. So I think I'm on board with the significance of the question for understanding the value of creating things. There might be great value in creating something that you don't think you're going to understand fully, but if you think you don't understand it at all, you shouldn't be creating it. That, however, leaves the theocentric idea very much intact.
All right. The next question is, well, so far you've given a very robust interaction with the intellectual problem of evil. So how would your approach change, or does it change when interacting with the emotional problem of evil? And the example there is, why would an all-loving God allow my aunt to die from COVID?
Okay. The first thing to say might be that one should not be expecting a solution to the intellectual problem to make it easy to bear the suffering that we don't understand. The intellectual problem will give you the background knowledge that you can always fall back on if you need to. Background knowledge that you should internalize to the effect that we do not understand how all the evils there are required. It may be in another world in some cases. And certainly the design of the universe, so far as we can see it, is not one in which every earthly life is worth living on Earth. That's asking a great deal. I don't think anyone who deals with the problem of evil tries to show that. But it certainly is possible that every evil is required for a greater good where there's the possibility of another life. And it might be possible even if there isn't, but that's much harder to show. So very roughly, dealing with the problem of evil intellectually is much harder if it can be shown that there can't possibly be any life beyond biological life on Earth. But I don't think anyone's ever shown that, or that it can be shown. Beyond that, I think the existential problem is with us to stay, and that there are various wise people who can tell you when they know you well how you can grapple with it best. But when the terrible news hits, it may be that tears in grief, not responded to verbally, and with no theological surroundings, are best left as the first stage. Maybe I should just tell you a little story here for a moment. A pastor I had long ago told of a time that he went to comfort someone who was in such grief that he was crying on the floor. The minister knew nothing better to do than to get down on the floor with him and cry himself. That empathy might have been the best thing he could do. Not everybody's like that, but that's one story.
All right. So the next question is the earlier non-merit view of love that was referred to distinct from a, and I'll see if I pronounce this right, Wittgensteinian fideistic view of love's meaning and significance to religiosity, as argued by D.Z. Phillips?
There may be two things mixed in that question. I want to sort them out. I think I heard two different strains. Why don't you give it to me again?
Yeah, sure. So is the earlier non-merit view of love referred to, is that view of love distinct from a Wittgensteinian fideistic view of love's meaning and significance to religiosity?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, but someone who holds the fideistic view could still agree on what I'm holding. I said love is not a meritarian attitude. To bring out something about love which is very difficult to grasp once you realize that in loving people, we do care about traits of theirs, and we can even say, I love her for A and B and C, but loving her isn't just a matter of valuing A and B and C as good traits she has. So that's a philosophical view, a view in what we call moral psychology of love. Fideism is usually a view that takes a non-ratiocinative, non-philosophically reasoned perspective in religion. And in Phillips, and maybe in some of Wittgenstein, one treats religious language not as descriptive of how the universe and the world really are, but as expressive in the way poetry is expressive, with some directives for how we are to live. But those directives are more prescriptive than they are descriptive of the actual universe. So Wittgensteinian fideism is what you might call metaphysically light. That's probably an understatement. I've been giving you something that is not metaphysically light. It's metaphysically pretty heavy. But I'm afraid that what Christians and others who are serious theists are asked to accept is metaphysically pretty heavy. Still, I think Christians should embrace fideists in the Wittgensteinian tradition if they want to live within the spirit and the moral and attitudinal emotional guidance of Scripture. So I don't want to say nobody who's metaphysically light can fit into the Christian family. Rather, one knows the family better with a little more metaphysics. So I hope that helps.
Okay, next question is shorter. So can you explain what you mean by divine experience as having value? Well, if God is understood as commanding a certain way of life for us, I think we should take it, given the perfect goodness of God, that the commanded way of life is good. And I thus think that God should be, broadly speaking, displeased if we depart from that, and pleased if, in the right ways, we live in the kind of mode that Jesus modeled for us, okay? It all hangs together very well. It's a very natural thing. So why think that God is absolutely impassible, no reactions? I tend to think of God personally, myself, and it looks to me as though Scripture is closest to us and best understood if we think that God acts in history, not to mention the incarnation. So for Christianity in particular, if incarnation is intelligible, as I think it is, then the idea of God acting in history and God having a sense of the valuable is quite coherent and intelligible. So the next question is, you seem to suggest earlier that God might not know each free choice of free agents, yet God knows what such creatures are like. So if a world is good enough for God to actualize, could God have done better?
This is a tough one. Think about how you know anything about the future. You can know that you are going to raise a hand because you intend to. And you can know that someone else is going to raise a hand because you know the person and can predict that that person will raise a hand to ask a question in a discussion. Now, God would have both ways of knowing what a free being will do in the future if God is in time, and the time we ask about foreknowledge is before the time of the free act. Now, God can command an act, order it by fiat, in which case it isn't free. And if determinism's true, then from any state of affairs at a given time, an omniscient being could foresee every state of affairs at a later time. So those are two ways God could foreknow what free beings will do and do in any situation. But I don't think God has created a deterministic world. I don't think this is a deterministic world, and neither do physicists generally. But suppose it is, that's another problem. I don't think God would create a deterministic world. And so you do get the possibility that God knows what kind of world is choice-worthy and anticipates certain sorts of evils, but doesn't anticipate every single free action in full detail. So that is a way of indicating that the choice of a world to actualize is more complicated than one might think. And it might be that even if there is a best possible world, it's not necessarily the most desirable world, and in it, maybe not all free actions are foreseen. Now, we're talking about God as being in time, but I'm thinking that if God's in time, that doesn't entail that God has an unacceptable kind of dependency on time. I think some thinkers, maybe in the Thomistic tradition, prefer to think of God as outside time, partly because time might seem to be something that ought to be created, and so it can't be co-eternal with God. Well, that's pretty abstract. I don't see any limitation in omnipotence, omniscience, or perfect goodness in God's being in time, myself.
Could God actualize many different worlds at the same time, some having more suffering or sin than others?
Well, if you think of a world as a universe and of a universe as containing everything that exists, then there can't be more than one universe. But some theorists talk about multiverses, and these are realms that have the properties of what we call our universe, but are not, to my understanding, not reachable in principle from one another. I don't work on that professionally, so I don't have a lot to say about that. I'm inclined to think that from the point of view of theology, if the universe is composed of multiverses, so be it. And if that's what you mean, okay. So the universe, that is everything that exists, could be constituted by things like galaxies not reachable in principle even from one another. No one is reachable from any other. I'm not sure how you'd conceive multiverses. So this is speculative metaphysics.
All right. So some think that God is not bound by any standard outside of God. So God is ex lex. Were this right, could one object to premise one of the presented argument from evil?
Okay. What was that one word that sounded, God is not what?
God is not bound by any standard outside of him.
Yeah. What was, keep going.
Oh, God is ex lex.
Ex what?
Ex lex, L-E-X.
I get it. Outside any law. Right? Yeah. Look, omnipotence is normally understood as the power to do anything logically possible. So we have the question whether God could create a round square. Well, creating a round square sounds like a description of an action. But since it's absolutely impossible that there be a round square, there is no action of creating a round square. So on my view, and on the view of many, it's no limitation of omnipotence not to be able to do, in scare quotes, something logically impossible. We don't know what a round square is. We can't understand it except well enough to know there can't be one. And we wouldn't understand what it is to create one. So it doesn't help us to say God could create a round square. On the other hand, we don't have to say this logical requirement, or rather, impossibility, is outside God. Why not say the necessary truths, like the laws of logic, are not above God, but within God? So that's the view I take. They're part of the framework of the divine mind. You don't want to make God unintelligible just to be able to take every laudatory epithet you can think of, like do anything imaginable or anything, describable, like creating a round square. It doesn't flatter God to be able to attribute the impossible to God. It's quite enough to be able to do anything possible.
All right, so we had just a couple more questions. This one is also somewhat longer. With regards to the infant burning in the fire scenario, isn't it also possible for God to have made the infant a philosophical zombie? And if you need clarification, I can give you that. In such a case, the infant is acting as a companion to actual actors like animals.
Well, I think if the infant's a philosophical zombie, there's no pain. So then you don't get the analogy to the animal, unless you think maybe the animal doesn't have pain either. But Descartes, anyway, who's very pious, so far as we can tell, would have said, look, infants do really suffer, and it's an idea we shouldn't find so clear and distinct if it isn't true. So I would say, look, it's logically possible that animal pain is unreal, and that when anybody innocent seems to be in pain, it's not really pain, there's not real suffering, it's just the behavioral manifestation of it. So if you like, that's trying to solve the problem of evil by burying some quite evident evils. It won't stop people from leaving the faith over the problem of evil. And it'll be awfully hard to swallow yourself when you hear the realistic cries of a dog that's been hit by a car and isn't dead, and the, pains of someone burned. I'm not able to zombieize there. So I see the question as having real theoretical interest, but I don't know how to make good use of it in the problem of evil.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, why conclude that if God foreknows what, say, Bob will choose, then the choice isn't free?
Good question. I didn't imply that foreknowledge entails lack of freedom. So I'm going to raise my hand again. I assure you I'm going to do this for illustration. I think I did it freely, but you foreknew from my honesty and statement of intention and, being in normal circumstances that I would do it. My point was quite different. It was that you can't assume in dealing with the problem of evil that when God actualizes a choice-worthy world, God knows everything free beings are going to do. So it looks as though we have to suppose that God almost has to have a kind of faith that free beings will, on the whole, behave in a way that is at least such that if it goes wrong, some rectification is possible. So what you could say is, if you had the powers of God, you wouldn't need to know what every free being's going to do, because you'd know how to arrange the future world so that free beings who do wrong are treated as having failed in a certain way and reformed, let's say. And innocents who suffer are made whole again. That's entirely intelligible. So the question brings out a good point about foreknowledge and freedom, and enables me to clarify further how the framework, the theocentric framework I'm proposing, works.
Okay. Next question is, could your view be considered close to Plantinga's O Felix Culpa, which says that things like the incarnation and atonement are such great goods that they counterbalance the evil in this world?
The atonement, what was the other thing?
The incarnation and atonement.
Yeah, the incarnation, of course, to have the atonement. Well, Christians are certainly committed to taking these to be great goods and to be essential to providing a sense of how evil is defeated. But if Al didn't mean that as part of what he was saying, then I don't know how to answer whether these things alone are great enough goods. We don't even know all the evils that are yet to come. But the point is, whatever evils are to come, if we take the incarnation, you don't even have to mention the atonement. If you take the incarnation really seriously, then you've got a vision of life in another world, which is the really crucial thing needed in the problem of evil.
Okay, how would you respond to the following question? If God is all powerful, all good, all loving, and all knowing, why wouldn't he do what he knows is necessary, which he's powerful enough to accomplish and would lovingly want to happen, my own salvation?
Well, the question appears to be very pessimistic about universal salvation, but no less a theologically informed person than my old friend Marilyn Adams, I think, among many others, accepted universal salvation. If that is accepted, and indeed it's certainly one understanding of Christianity, one doesn't have to take the view that evil is ignored, that wrongdoing is free. Universal salvation can come after condign punishment. So it's up to God how to handle afterlife for those who've done terrible things. And I trust that the questioner will be saved. I mean, certainly that's the right attitude to take. That's certainly minimally a rational hope. Now, by the way, I don't mind follow-ups. So we have enough time, perhaps, that depends on the group, for follow-up. So if you don't think I've answered your question or you have a comeback, that's okay. I don't mind being pushed.
Yeah, actually, the next question is a follow-up to the one you just responded to. So
Okay.
can you explain what you mean exactly by universal salvation?
Well, it means the salvation of everybody. It means nobody is forever damned or forever on the outside. And, you know, if you take the view that human dignity is intrinsic to being human, and you take the view that every person is a child of God, well, you can build on that, condign punishments, but, you know, capital punishment, that's not what we give wayward children. Now, adults who do wrong are worse than wayward children, but if you think with God all things are possible, then you can think it's possible both to do the appropriate things that wrongdoing calls for retributively in terms of punishment, and do good things thereafter.
Okay, the next question asks, is it possible or conceivable that a better world than this one could have included moral evil, that is to allow for freedom and avoid determinism, and yet have avoided natural evil?
Well, I don't know how to argue that it's impossible, but I gave you the example of the skinned knee, and we certainly can see that some natural evils, given that we're the kinds of beings we are essential to developing our full understanding and appreciation of others. And it may be that even though love is possible without any natural evils, its fullest and widest expression might occur where natural evils are being overcome.
Okay, there's just a couple more questions here. How do you think your idea of the possibility of an afterlife as being a valid, possible, redemptive operator in the problem squares with Ivan Karamazov's protest to such a conception?
I'm not remembering the novel well enough to answer that without a little spelling out. We know that he wasn't willing to kill to bring about great goods, but I don't recognize the exact reference of this question. Can the questioner spell it out? Maybe we need to go to the next question first and then come back. I'm not sure.
Yes, I'll come back to that one if we get clarification there. But it looks like there's just one other question left here. Would you say that all of God's natural knowledge is part of God's free knowledge, yet there are propositions that are members of God's free knowledge, but not his natural knowledge?
Now, this comes out of theology, I think. And I may have to ask for a little clarification here, but one would think that free knowledge would be knowledge God creates by creating the being it's about. Although notice, if determinism's true, then in God's creating any being in a deterministic world, God's automatically going to know, even foreknow, the whole history of that created being. So if you like, the freest knowledge might be the knowledge that is I guess, initially unavailable, and then comes from knowing what the free being did, which wasn't foreknowable, if the world is not deterministic. What would God's natural knowledge be? Well, I mean, all the a priori knowledge of things that are, eternal, like numerical truths, logical truths. So that would be natural to God, whether there's a creation or not. I'm just speculating on what the questioner might have in mind. Does the person who asked about Ivan Karamazov want to come back in with that? And then maybe the person who asked this will come back in on this one.
Yes, we did get clarification on the question about Karamazov. And he said, basically, such a child's suffering is too horrendous to be able to have been allowed in the first place. And even the most wonderful afterlife is too small of a ransom or payback for such suffering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I sympathize with the idea that the terrible suffering is just so great that you existentially can't see how it should exist in a world created by a perfectly good God with omniscience and omnipotence. But I think this question shows an insufficient appreciation for the organicity of value. So I better go back to the painting. A painting that is a great success could have a part that, taken outside the painting, is ugly. But in the context of the painting, there's an integration between the characteristics of that part and the characteristics of the rest, with the result that the whole is better than it would have been with some vanilla or, just merely compatible part. So if all there was in that life was the suffering, and there wasn't any afterlife, and there wasn't any great role that played in the canvas of the universe, that would be a problem. But we have no reason to think that. Not only could this play a role in the canvas of the universe, but if there's afterlife, then the child who dies painfully in the forest fire could have a life which as a whole might incorporate that as a part which, by contrast and integration with the rest, is a little like the part of the painting which, taken in isolation, is ugly. So in principle, an understanding of value as organic can deal with a thing like that, at least in outline. The details are up to God.
And we did get clarification about the question about God's natural knowledge versus free knowledge.
Okay.
Meaning God's knowledge prior to creation versus God's knowledge as temporal.
Okay. Well, I can refine what I've said, but I don't know that I want to revise it. Maybe I have to, but look, if God knows a lot about the world and a lot about the kinds of beings we are, God could know before we do something freely that it's very probable we'll do it. But without determinism, there'd be only knowledge of probabilities. Now, the proposition that it's probable someone will do something is not the same proposition as that the person will do it. And you could suppose that God would not form a belief that you will do it, even if it is very probable, because God won't form beliefs that don't constitute knowledge, and a belief that isn't 100% probable, if you like, certain, wouldn't be suitable for the divine mind. So that's a way to explain this. Look, take a lottery. If it's got 1 million tickets and it's fair and you hold one ticket, you still don't know you're going to lose. You're in the same position as the person who wins one ticket in a fair lottery. And that person is going to win and doesn't know I'm going to lose. So God is not going to believe that I'll freely raise my hand if it's only immensely probable given the past. And under indeterminism, it would be at most immensely probable. Why does God need to know what a free being is going to do in any possible situation? In order to know that certain kinds of free beings that deserve certain love are appropriate to a choice-worthy, a theologically choice-worthy world. Again, I don't think there's a best possible world, but even if there is, I suppose it's merely shocking to think it might contain you and me. Not obviously false, I hope.
Okay. Another question is, if one believes in the existence of a new earth or heaven where there is no evil, why could God not have started humanity in that state?
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's really very interesting. I don't really know what various theologies are committed to on whether heaven has no evil, as opposed to no evils of a certain sort. And certainly we can suppose no evils that aren't recompensed. And then it's up to God in what realm to create and what kinds of beings to create.
Okay, so we have another follow-up question to the earlier question about universal salvation. So where in scripture do you see this idea of universal salvation evidenced?
That's really a question for a theologian. I suspect, though, from what I remember, that there may be no passage that can be read only as promising that. But I don't know whether there are passages inconsistent with it. And given Jesus' emphasis on forgiveness along with the centrality of love, one could, I think, suppose that it's entirely in line with the overall spirit of the Gospels.
Okay, so it looks like we really only have one question left. And it is belief in God really rational, given the evils of this world?
Okay. I'm going to have to do what a philosopher does, which is to disambiguate. When you say, is belief in or is belief that rational, you can mean either, is so-and-so's believing this rational, where you've got so-and-so with his or her evidence and life experience, Or you can mean, is the proposition rational for anybody, whatever, who thinks about it? Now, that nothing is round and square is rational for anybody. The self-evidence rational for anybody who understands it. And if you like, you can say it's rational for any self-interested person or, any moral person to take a vaccine. You could argue that. So why not say there are plenty of lives in which belief in God and belief that God loves us, and of course, trust in God, and certainly hope in God, all that. There are lives in which that's rational. Now, are there lives in which it isn't? Well, maybe somebody's, got such one-sided evidence and such a terrible set of experiences that you could say, well, for that person, it's not rational, though it could be. So I've certainly been very positive about the possibility of a rational religious commitment, particularly in the kind of Christian tradition I'm talking about, the Christian tradition in general. But I'm not supposing evidence plays no role, and I'm not supposing one's life experience plays no role. So roughly, we can talk about a cumulative case that you might have. And your cumulative case will be a little different from anybody else's. There will be all you've learned intellectually, philosophically, theologically, and there will be your life experience. If you've been loved, in a way, you've been blessed. There may be people who haven't been loved much, if at all. That's terrible. Well, that's a very bad kind of experience to have. We can hope to help such people. And helping them is partly a matter of how we relate to them affectionately and ethically, not just a matter of what we believe about them and what we do materially.
All right, thank you so much for answering all those questions, and thank you everyone for submitting them. That was the last question, so I will turn it back over to Zach.
All right, thank you, Helena, and thank you, Dr. Audi, for answering those questions for us. Before we close, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah from the Christian Grad Fellowship. So Sarah, tell us about that.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Sarah, and I'm here representing the Christian Grads Fellowship. It's the only Bible study on campus that caters specifically to graduate students. We're an interdenominational group, super fun. One of our main focuses is on how our faith in Christ impacts our research. So, for example, for me, I'm in computer science. So one of the questions I might ask is, what are God's thoughts on the code that I'm writing for some project? We just finished a study on mere Christianity, so we're wrapping up for the semester, but we'll have some meetings during summer, and we'll have a regular schedule in fall. So we'd love to have you. If you want to learn more, email us at unl.christiangrads@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. I'll also put the email in the YouTube chat.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. That's all we have for tonight, so thank you all for coming. Hopefully you've all learned something, or at least have something to think about, and I know that I've learned plenty and have some new things to think about. So thank you all for coming, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you. And Adam, why don't you stay